A
Stop right
story of
there.
fear,
Give me the
fire,
box.
and the most dangerous
No,
kind of
leave me
safety.
alone.
Rodney spent 3 years convincing Laura that no lock, no city, and no restraining order would ever put enough distance between them until she moved into the apartment next door to a man who didn't need locks. Because everything and everyone within 6 blocks already belonged to him. The cardboard box in Laura Thomas's arms weighed almost nothing. A few folded shirts, a phone charger, a framed photo she kept turning face down, but she carried it like it held the last fragile thing left of her life. Because it did. It was 11:15 on a Wednesday night, and the walkway of the Greenvale Terrace apartment complex stretched ahead of her like a lit-up runway, modern, sleek, impossibly quiet. The kind of quiet that made a woman who had survived 3 years of flinching at every slammed door feel, for exactly 9 seconds, like she might actually be safe. 9 seconds. That was all she got. Because Rodney Mosley, 6'3", 240 pounds of obsession wrapped in a dirty gray t-shirt, had followed her coworker Denise's car to the complex 2 nights earlier, and he had been waiting ever since. Now his footsteps hit the concrete behind her like gunshots, heavy and deliberate, full of a rhythm she knew in her bones. And the only thing standing between Laura and the worst night of her life was the thin, locked door of apartment 4B and the man behind the door next to it. A man she had never met. A man dressed in pitch black, with intricate tattoos creeping up his neck and forearms, who would step onto that walkway with the calm of someone being mildly inconvenienced by a noise complaint, and who would make 240 pounds of unchecked violence take a step backward without uttering a single word. In that single moment, Laura would realize she hadn't just escaped a monster. She had moved in next door to something far, far worse. Before we start, go ahead and subscribe, like, and share where you're watching from. It always warms my heart to see our little storytelling family stretch across the world. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you give helps us keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. So find your quiet place, settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've never been before. Laura Thomas had rehearsed this moment for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of sleeping on her coworker Denise's pull-out couch, saving every spare dollar, scanning apartment listings with the desperation of a woman reading exit signs in a burning building. She had found Greenvale Terrace online at 2 a.m. On a Tuesday, a sleek, modern complex on the east side of the city, far enough from Rodney's usual territory that it might as well have been another country. She paid the deposit in cash. She gave a fake employer reference. She told no one, not even Denise's exact address, just the neighborhood. And now here she was, 11:15 on a Wednesday night, walking the illuminated 4th-floor walkway with a single cardboard box in her arms and the terrifying, electric feeling that she was about to start breathing again for the first time in 3 years. The complex was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, when you've spent your whole life surrounded by broken ones, clean concrete walls, brushed steel railings, recessed lighting that cast the walkway in a warm, golden glow, like the building itself was trying to convince her she deserved to be here. The building rose 6 stories, each floor ringed by an open-air walkway that overlooked a manicured courtyard below. Her apartment 4B was at the far end of the 4th floor, and as she walked toward it, the click of her flats against the concrete was the only sound in the world. She fished the key from her pocket without putting down the box. Her hands were steady, her breathing was even. She allowed herself one small, fragile thought. Maybe this is what safe feels like. She was sliding the key into the lock when she heard it. Not a sound, exactly. A shift. The way the air changes pressure before a storm, or the way a room goes cold when someone opens a door you didn't know was there. Laura's fingers froze on the key. Her shoulders locked. And then, from the far end of the walkway, the direction she had just come from footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, spaced apart with the confidence of a man who has never once had to hurry because the thing he was hunting had never once gotten away. No. The word fired through her skull like a flare, but her body was already ahead of her brain. She pulled the key from the lock, couldn't get it to turn. not with her hands shaking like this, and pressed herself flat against the concrete wall beside the door. The box was still in her arms. She couldn't put it down, couldn't move, couldn't think past the sound of those boots getting closer, each step a countdown to something she had spent 6 weeks, and every dollar she had trying to outrun. Rodney Mosley came around the corner of the walkway like a man who had been walking toward her his entire life. He stood 6'3" and carried 240 pounds without an ounce of it going soft, a battering ram in human form. His gray t-shirt hung loose and filthy, dark patches of sweat under each arm, a tear near the collar that could have been from a fight or from his own restless, destructive hands. His jeans were smeared with grime. His fists hung at his sides like wrecking balls on short chains, not swinging, just waiting. His face was the worst part. It always was. That expression she knew better than her own reflection. The locked jaw, the flared nostrils, the eyes that had gone somewhere far past anger into a place where hurting her was not a choice but a biological function. Like breathing. He spotted her instantly. Of course he did. She was pressed against a wall in a red satin blouse, clutching a cardboard box like a child holding a stuffed animal during a thunderstorm. She might as well have been standing under a spotlight. There she is. His voice carried down the walkway, low and thick, almost affectionate in the way a trap is affectionate when it finally closes. 6 weeks, Laura. 6 weeks you had me looking. You think I wasn't watching Denise's place the whole time? Saw her little Honda pull out Tuesday night loaded heavy on one side. Followed it straight here. He grinned, the kind of grin that had nothing to do with joy. You know how that made me feel? Laura's throat sealed shut. She couldn't answer. Couldn't breathe. Her vision was narrowing the way it always did when Rodney got close, the world shrinking to a tunnel with him at the end of it. Getting bigger. Getting closer. Filling every inch of available space until there was no room left for anything but him and the thing he was about to do. He was 15 feet away. 10. She could smell him now, cigarettes and cheap cologne and the sour metallic tang of a man who had been feeding on his own rage for days. Her knees were failing. The box was slipping. She opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out, because 3 years with Rodney had taught her that screaming didn't bring help. It brought consequences. 5 feet. And then the door to apartment 4A opened. The lock disengaged with a sound so clean and precise it cut through the moment like a scalpel through gauze. The door swung inward, not quickly, not slowly, just inevitably, and amber light poured onto the walkway in a wide, warm stripe. Into that light stepped Mio Kwang, and the entire temperature of the night changed. He was dressed in black from collar to shoe. A crisp button-down, sleeves rolled once to reveal forearms wrapped in elaborate tattoo work, coiling dragons, geometric lattices, characters in a language Laura didn't recognize. All rendered in ink so dark and detailed, it looked less like body art and more like armor. The tattoos continued up the back of his hands to his knuckles, and more crept above his collar, climbing the left side of his neck like ivy on a wall that had seen centuries. His black trousers were tailored to the millimeter. His shoes were spotless. His hair was pushed back from a face that could have been handsome if it had contained any warmth at all, but it didn't. It was still. Perfectly, terrifyingly still, like the surface of deep water that could swallow you without producing a single ripple. Mio didn't rush. He didn't posture. He stepped onto the walkway, leaned his right forearm against the steel railing, and looked at Rodney with an expression that Laura would spend weeks trying to name and never quite succeed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hostility. It was something closer to the look a man gives a fly that has landed on his dinner, mild irritation sharpened to a point by the absolute certainty that removing it would require no effort whatsoever. Rodney stopped. His boots scraped the concrete like a needle dragged off a record. He was close enough now for Laura to see the veins standing out on his forearms, the white-knuckle clench of his fists, the sweat rolling down his temples. But his eyes had left Laura entirely, and were locked on the man leaning against the railing with the casual, immovable weight of a parked tank. "The hell are you looking at?" Rodney said. The words were loud, but the energy behind them had shifted. Something in his voice had gone from diesel engine to idling car. Mayo said nothing. He tilted his head approximately 2 degrees to the left. That was all. 2 degrees and silence. But that silence had texture. It had weight. It moved through the air between them like something physical, pressing against Rodney's chest, his throat, the space behind his eyes where the decision-making happened. Laura watched it work in real time, watched the most violent man she had ever known recalculate, recalibrate, and arrive at a conclusion his ego would never admit. But his survival instinct could not ignore. Rodney took a step backward. Then another. Rodney's snarl melted into something uglier, confusion laced with the first flicker of fear, and he jabbed a thick finger in Laura's direction. "This ain't over, Laura. Not even close." He pointed at her, but the finger was shaking. Not much. Just enough. He turned and walked away. His stride, which had been a battering ram 60 seconds ago, was now just a man leaving. The footsteps faded. The parking structure swallowed him. And the night went quiet again, except for the low hum of the walkway lights and the ragged, broken sound of Laura trying to remember how lungs worked. She didn't know how long she stood there. Long enough for the box to slide from her arms and hit the concrete with a dull thud. Long enough for her knees to buckle until she was half crouching against the wall, her palms flat on the ground, her breath coming in wet, shuddering gasps that she couldn't control and couldn't silence. "Come inside." 2 words. His voice was low, unhurried, accented in a way that sharpened each consonant and softened each vowel. Laura looked up. Mayo was standing by his open door, one hand resting on the frame, looking at her with the same clinical detachment he had aimed at Rodney, but underneath it, just barely, something else. Not pity. Something more practical than pity. Recognition, maybe. The way one survivor recognizes another. Laura picked up the box. She didn't know why. She walked through his door on legs that felt borrowed from someone else, and he closed it behind her with that same precise click. The inside of apartment 4A was nothing like what she expected. There was almost no furniture. A single low-profile couch in charcoal gray. A glass coffee table with nothing on it. No photographs. No books. No clutter of any kind. The walls were bare and white, and the kitchen was spotless in a way that suggested it had never been cooked in, or that someone cleaned it with military discipline after every use. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and something metallic she couldn't place. But it was the far wall of the living room that stopped her breathing for an entirely different reason. 3 flat-screen monitors were mounted side by side, each displaying a grid of security camera feeds. She recognized the walkway she had just been standing on, the parking structure, the lobby, the stairwells. Every angle of the building, captured in high definition and cycling through feeds in 5-second intervals. Beneath the monitors, a slim black console sat on a matte desk, flanked by 2 phones, neither of which looked like anything you could buy at a retail store. This was not a home. This was a command center with a couch in it. Mayo set a glass of water in front of her without being asked. He sat on the opposite end of the couch, leaving a deliberate distance between them, and said nothing. He let her shake, let her cry, let the silence do what it needed to do. When she finally looked at him, really looked, he was watching the monitors, his tattooed hand resting on his knee, his face as unreadable as the first page of a book written in a language she hadn't learned yet. "He'll come back," Laura whispered. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Mayo said. No softening, no reassurance, just the truth, delivered with the flat efficiency of a man who considered lying a waste of time. "What do I do?" He looked at her then, directly, and for the first time, she saw something shift behind those dark, clinical eyes, a flicker of something ancient and personal, gone before she could name it. "You stop being easy to break." Over the next 5 days, Laura learned that Mayo Kwang did not give advice. He gave instructions. And his instructions operated on a logic that was completely alien to every instinct her body had spent 3 years building. On the first day, he told her to stand in his living room and breathe. Just breathe. When she started shaking, because she always started shaking, her body's default state was now a low-grade tremor. He didn't tell her to calm down. He told her to notice it. "Your hands," he said, standing 6 feet away with his arms folded. "Watch them. Don't stop them. Just watch." She watched her hands tremble for 11 minutes straight before the trembling, with nowhere to go and no reaction to feed on, simply ran out of fuel and stopped. On the second day, he taught her about her face. He sat her in front of a mirror and stood behind her. "When you're afraid," he said, "your eyes go wide, your mouth opens, your chin drops. Every muscle in your face is a signal flare telling the threat exactly how much power it has. Rodney reads your face the way a gambler reads cards. You've been showing him your hand for 3 years. He taught her to control it. Jaw forward, eyes level, mouth closed. Not angry anger, was just fear wearing a costume. Still, he taught her to make her face a wall that gave nothing away. On the third day, he taught her to walk. She hadn't realized her walk had changed until Mayo pointed it out. "You move like something hunted," he said, watching her cross the living room. Small steps, shoulders curved, head tilted down. Every step is an apology for being visible. He made her walk back and forth across the apartment until her stride lengthened, her shoulders dropped, and her chin came up, not with defiance, but with the quiet, mechanical certainty of a woman who was no longer asking the room for permission to be in it. On the 4th day, he said something that cracked her open. "Fear is not your enemy." He was leaning against the kitchen counter, a cup of black coffee in his tattooed hand, the monitors glowing behind him. "Fear is information. It tells you where the danger is, how fast it's moving, how much time you have. The problem is not that you feel fear, the problem is that you perform it. You give it to Rodney like a gift, and he unwraps it every time." Laura stared at him. "How do you know so much about fear?" Something moved behind his eyes. Something old and heavy that he carried the way she carried her cardboard box close to the chest, always face down. "Because I used to perform it too," he said. "A long time ago, for people much worse than Rodney." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The tattoos told a story his mouth never would, and Laura was beginning to learn how to read the parts that were visible. Across the city, in a ground-floor apartment that smelled like malt liquor and burnt plastic, Rodney Mosley was making the worst decision of his life, and he was making it with the absolute confidence of a man who had never once been taught the difference between strength and destruction. He sat on a stained couch across from 2 men he had found through a cousin's cousin, members of a local crew called the 6th Ward Kings, who operated out of the East Side and had a reputation for the kind of violence that didn't come with terms and conditions. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Dex with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, listened to Rodney's pitch with the patient amusement of a man being offered a business deal by a child. "So let me get this straight," Dex said, leaning back, a toothpick rolling between his teeth. "You want us to run up on some apartment complex, drag out your ex-girl, and rough up whoever gets in the way? For what? Because she left you?" "Because she's mine," Rodney said, and the way he said it flat, certain, devoid of any awareness that a human being cannot belong to another human being made even Dex's lieutenant shift uncomfortably. "And some tatted-up Asian dude in the building thinks he can stare me down? Nah, I need numbers. I need bodies. I need that whole building to know that nobody keeps what's mine behind a locked door." Dex studied him for a long moment. Then he named a price. Rodney agreed without negotiating, because Rodney had never understood that the most dangerous transactions are the ones where you don't know the full cost until it's too late. The plan was simple. Cut the power, breach the stairwells, and flood the walkways with enough chaos that Laura would have nowhere to hide and no one to hide behind. Dex would bring 8 men. Rodney would lead them straight to apartment 4B. What Rodney didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because the information existed in a world he had no access to, was that the apartment complex he was planning to invade was not a building with a mysterious neighbor. It was the neighbor's building, Every unit, every floor, every lock, camera, and reinforced door. And the man Rodney had dismissed as a staring problem was currently sitting in apartment 4A, watching the security feeds cycle through their rotations, a phone in his tattooed hand, speaking in rapid Korean to someone who answered on the first ring. The storm Rodney was building had no idea it was heading straight into the sea that owned it. If you're hooked on Laura and Mayo's dangerous, impossible bond, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell because the next chapter is going to be insane. Comment below Team Laura or Team Mayo. And tell me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Don't miss what happens next. Laura's newfound strength is about to face its deadliest test yet. See you in the next one. It happened on the 5th night, the way most truths happen between people who have spent their lives building walls accidentally, in the dark, when both of them were too tired to keep the doors locked. Laura couldn't sleep. She had been lying on her bare mattress in 4B, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the building hum around her like a living thing. At 1:10 in the morning, she knocked on Mayo's door softly, the way she now did everything, with intention rather than apology. He opened it without asking who it was. She suspected he had watched her approach on the monitors long before her knuckles touched the wood. He was sitting on the couch with a glass of something dark, and a look on his face she had never seen before. Not the clinical mask, not the bored indifference. Something raw. Something that looked, if she was being honest, like a man visiting a room inside himself that he normally kept padlocked. She sat on the opposite end of the couch. He didn't acknowledge her arrival, and she didn't demand it. They had developed a language over these 5 days that operated almost entirely below the surface of words, a system of silences, nods, and careful distances that communicated more than any conversation Laura had ever had with a man who claimed to love her. "The dragon on your left forearm," she said quietly. "It's different from the others. Older. The lines are rougher." Mayo looked down at his arm as though he'd forgotten it was there. He turned his wrist slowly, and the dragon, a coiling, furious thing with its jaws open around what appeared to be a broken chain, caught the low light from the monitors. "I was 14, he said. Laura waited. She had learned from him that waiting was its own kind of language, and it said, "I'm not going anywhere." My father owed money to a man in Busan. Not a small amount. The kind of amount that turns a family into collateral. He took a sip from the glass. His voice was the same flat, precise instrument it always was, but beneath it, something was shifting tectonic plates moving under still ground. When he couldn't pay, they didn't come for him. They came for me. I was leverage. A 14-year-old boy in a room with no windows, learning very quickly that fear is not an emotion. It is a technology. And the men who understand how to operate it will always control the men who don't. Laura's chest tightened. She didn't speak. I spent 11 months in that room. When they let me out, I was not the same boy who went in. The boy who went in was afraid of everything. The boy who came out was afraid of nothing because there was nothing left to be afraid of. They had used it all up, and what was left underneath was something they did not expect. He set the glass down. I was not rescued, Laura. I was forged. And when I was old enough, I went back to every man who had been in that room with me, and I made sure they understood what they had built. He looked at her then directly, fully, and for the first time since she had met him, Laura saw the man behind the machine. A boy who had been broken in a room with no windows and had rebuilt himself into something so controlled, so precise, so lethally disciplined, that the world he now commanded didn't even know it was being commanded. The tattoos weren't decoration. They were a map of every fire he had walked through and a promise that he would never burn again. "That's why you're teaching me," Laura whispered. It wasn't a question. "I am teaching you," Mayo said, "because I recognize the look in your eyes. It is the same look I had when I was 14, pressed against a wall, performing my fear for men who fed on it. And I am teaching you because no one taught me. I had to learn it in the worst possible classroom. You don't." Something broke open in Laura's chest, not painfully, but the way ice breaks on a river in spring, letting what was trapped beneath it finally move. She didn't cry. She had done enough crying. Instead, she looked at this man, this terrifying, tattooed, impossibly controlled man who had built an empire out of his own wreckage and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not safety. Mayo was far too dangerous to represent safety. Recognition. The understanding that she was not sitting next to a stranger. She was sitting next to the only person alive who knew exactly what it felt like to be someone else's property and who had decided, with every fiber of his rebuilt self, that it would never happen again. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The monitors cycled. The building hummed. And somewhere between one breath and the next, Laura felt the last tremor in her hands go quiet, not because she forced it, but because, for the first time, her body believed it was sitting next to someone who would not let her be taken back to that room. Not hers. His. But the room was the same. The lights went out at 11:47 p.m. on a Saturday, 6 days after Laura had arrived at Greenvale Terrace with a cardboard box and a prayer. Not gradually, the way a power grid fails, flickering, dimming, stuttering back to life before finally giving up. This was surgical. One moment the walkways were bathed in their usual warm amber glow, and the next, every light in the complex died simultaneously, as if someone had reached into the building's chest and stopped its heart. Laura was in 4B when it happened. She had been standing at the kitchen counter, pouring a glass of water, and the sudden blackness hit her like a physical blow. Her hand jerked. The glass shattered in the sink. For 3 full seconds, she was back in Rodney's apartment, back in the dark hallway where he used to cut the breaker before he came for her, because he liked the advantage that blindness gave him. Then Mayo's training kicked in. She noticed the fear. She watched it rise through her body like mercury in a thermometer, chest, throat, jaw, eyes. And instead of performing it, she contained it. She set her hands flat on the counter. She leveled her breathing. She made her face still gave it nothing to broadcast, nothing to betray. Her phone buzzed. A single text from a number she didn't recognize. Stay inside. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. She locked the door. 3 floors below, in the courtyard that separated the east and west wings of the complex, Rodney Mosley was grinning. He stood in the center of the darkened space, with Dex and 8 men fanned out behind him, thick silhouettes carrying crowbars, bats, and the kind of economy brand handguns that spoke more to desperation than to professionalism. They had cut the main power junction in the utility room off the parking structure. Dex's guy had handled the backup generator with a pair of bolt cutters and 30 seconds of uninterrupted access. 4th floor, Rodney said, pointing upward into the dark. Apartment 4B, end of the walkway. The door's cheap 1 kick and it folds. Dex nodded and split his crew into 2 groups, 4 up the east stairwell, 4 up the west, converging on the 4th floor walkway from both ends. A pincer. Simple, brutal, effective. Rodney would go up the middle, straight to Laura's door, and finish what he had come to finish. What none of them saw, what they could not have seen, because the darkness they had created was working against them now, as much as it worked for them, were the doors that had already opened across the building. Apartment 2, A. Apartment 3, C. Apartment 5, B. 6 doors in total, spread across the building's 6 stories, each one releasing a man who moved through the darkness with the fluid, unhurried precision of someone who had rehearsed this exact scenario dozens of times. They wore black. They carried nothing visible. And they communicated in a series of brief, silent hand signals that belonged to a language older than the building they were defending. Mayo's men, his lieutenants, the quiet tenants who paid rent on time and never attended building socials and kept their apartments as sparse and operational as his own. The building wasn't just a front. It was a fortress, and its garrison had just been activated. Dex's crew hit the east stairwell first, 4 men moving fast, boots hammering the concrete steps, flashlights cutting white beams through the black air. They made it to the 3rd floor landing before the first man in line stopped abruptly, his flashlight illuminating nothing but an empty corridor ahead. He didn't see the arm that came from behind the stairwell door. He didn't hear the strike. He simply folded sideways into the wall and stopped making noise. The second man turned. A hand caught his wrist, redirected the flashlight into his own eyes, and in the half-second of blindness that followed, something hit him below the ribs with surgical accuracy. He went down gasping, the bat clattering out of his grip and rolling down the steps. On the west stairwell, it was worse. Dex's other team made it to the 4th floor and spilled onto the walkway, expecting empty corridors and a clear path to 4B. Instead, they found 2 men standing shoulder to shoulder in the darkness, utterly still, waiting with the patience of predators who had been watching their prey stumble toward them on security feeds for the last 6 minutes. The fight, if it could be called, that lasted less than 90 seconds. It was not chaotic. It was not loud. It was mechanical, precise, and deeply one-sided, like watching a chess player dismantle an opponent who had brought checkers pieces to the board. By the time Dex realized that the stairwells had gone silent, that none of his men were responding, that the coordinated assault he had planned was collapsing floor by floor into a series of quiet, efficient neutralizations, it was already too late. He stood in the courtyard, alone now, turning in circles with his gun raised, and saw movement on the 2nd floor walkway above him. A single figure, leaning against the railing, looking down at him. Mayo Kwong. Even in the dark, Dex could see the tattoos, the dragons, the geometric patterns, the ink on the hands and the neck, and the forearms. And Dex, who had operated on the east side for 11 years, who had survived 3 gang wars and 2 stretches upstate, who feared very little, felt something cold and ancient uncoil in his stomach. Because he recognized those tattoos. Not the specific designs, but the language they belonged to, the organization they represented, the hierarchy they advertised. He lowered the gun. Slowly, the way a man lowers a weapon when he realizes he has been pointing it at the ocean. "We didn't know," Dex said. His voice was different now, smaller. "He didn't tell us this was yours." Mayo said nothing. He didn't need to. Dex turned, looked at Rodney, who was standing 10 feet away with the expression of a man who has just realized the ground beneath him is not ground at all, and made a decision that took less than a second. "We're done here," Dex said. He holstered the gun, turned his back on Rodney Mosley, and walked toward the parking structure. His remaining men, the ones still conscious, followed, 2 of them dragging their fallen crew members by the arms. They moved quickly, quietly, and with the unmistakable body language of men who understood they had stumbled into a room that was several floors above their clearance level. Rodney stood alone in the dark courtyard. The grin was gone, the army was gone, the plan was gone. But the obsession, the furnace inside him that had been burning for 3 years, the one that told him Laura was a thing he owned and a thing he would retrieve, was still there. And it drove him forward the way a broken engine drives a car straight into a wall. He took the east stairwell. He climbed the 4 flights in the dark, stumbling past the scuffed walls and dropped flashlights left behind by the failed assault without stopping. He reached the 4th floor walkway and turned toward 4B, breathing hard, fists clenched, every muscle in his body locked into the singular, mindless purpose he had always operated on. He kicked the door. It didn't fold. Mayo had reinforced it days ago, steel plate behind the wood, a deadbolt rated for 600 pounds of force. But Rodney kicked it again. And again. And on the 4th kick, the frame splintered enough for him to force it open, and he stumbled into Laura's dark apartment with the momentum of a wrecking ball that had forgotten what it was supposed to demolish. Laura was standing in the center of the living room. Not hiding, not crouching, not pressed against a wall with wide eyes and a trembling mouth. She was standing upright, feet shoulder-width apart, hands at her sides, chin level, eyes forward. Her face was a locked door with nothing behind it. No terror, no tears, no performance of the fear he had spent 3 years feeding on. Rodney stopped. For the first time in their entire history, he looked at Laura Thomas and did not see prey. He saw something he didn't have a category for: a woman standing in the dark with the stillness of someone who had already decided how this was going to end. "You think standing there like that changes something?" he snarled, but his voice cracked on the last word. The hairline fracture from the walkway 6 days ago had become a fault line. Laura's stillness was doing to him what Mayo's silence had done, pressing against the hollow place inside him where his power lived, and finding nothing solid underneath. "It changes everything," Laura said. Her voice was low, steady. It didn't shake. It didn't waver. It came from somewhere deeper than her throat, from the place Mayo had spent 5 days excavating. The place beneath the fear, beneath the performance, beneath the 3-year curriculum of shrink, silence, disappear. "You spent 3 years teaching me I was powerless, but you were wrong, Rodney. I was never powerless. I was just performing for you, and the show is over." Rodney lunged. It was instinct, the only response his body knew when his dominance was challenged. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, arm raised, hand open, aiming for the side of her face the way he always had, like muscle memory from a nightmare on repeat. Laura shifted. Not dramatically, not with the exaggerated flair of a movie fight. She stepped left, dropped her center of gravity exactly the way Mayo had shown her, and let Rodney's momentum carry him past her and into the kitchen counter. He hit it hard ribs first, and the impact folded him forward, gasping. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She stood exactly where she was, feet planted, face unreadable, watching him the way Mayo watched things, with the clinical patience of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome and found none of them threatening. Rodney pushed himself up from the counter, wheezing. He turned toward her again, and this time what was on his face was not rage. It was confusion. The deep, structural kind that happens when the operating system, a person has run their entire life on, encounters an input it cannot process. Laura was not cowering. Laura was not crying. Laura was standing in the dark, looking at him like he was a minor inconvenience, and his entire identity, built on the certainty that she would always break, was collapsing in real time. He took 1 step toward her, and a hand closed around his shoulder from behind. Mayo Kwong had entered the apartment through the connecting door between 4A and 4B, a door that had not been there when Laura moved in. Installed silently on the 3rd day while she was practicing her walk in his living room. She had noticed the faint smell of fresh plaster near the bedroom wall, but hadn't thought to question it. Now she understood. It was another modification to the fortress he had been quietly building around the woman next door. He stood behind Rodney now, 1 hand on his shoulder, and the grip was not aggressive. It was calm, final. The way someone closes a book they have finished reading. "She told you the show is over," Mayo said. His voice was barely above a whisper, and it was the most terrifying sound Laura had ever heard, not because of what it promised, but because of how little effort the promise required. Rodney tried to turn, tried to swing, tried to access the violence that had defined him for 3 decades. But Mayo's hand tightened once a single, precise application of pressure to a point on Rodney's shoulder that Laura didn't understand. But Rodney's nervous system understood immediately, and Rodney's knees buckled. He went down like a building losing its foundation, floor by floor, until he was kneeling on Laura's kitchen floor, gasping, his clenched fists finally opening. The whole architecture of his menace folding inward until there was nothing left but a man on his knees in the dark, surrounded by people who were no longer afraid of him. Laura looked down at him. She expected to feel triumph, or relief, or vindication, but what she felt was quieter than any of those things. She felt the absence of something, the weight she had been carrying for 3 years, the invisible box she had clutched to her chest every waking moment, heavier than anything cardboard could hold. It was gone. Not lifted, not set down, simply gone, as if it had never existed, as if her body had finally received the message that the war was over and the muscles could stand down. Mayo's men arrived 30 seconds later, 2 of them, moving through the connecting door with practiced efficiency. They took Rodney by the arms, lifted him from the floor, and escorted him out of the apartment without a word. Laura didn't ask where they were taking him. She didn't need to. Rodney Mosley had walked into a building owned by a man who made problems disappear for a living, and the look on Mayo's face as he watched Rodney being carried out said everything. This particular problem would not be returning. The power came back on at 12:34 a.m. The lights on the walkway flickered once, twice, then settled into their warm, amber glow as if nothing had happened. Somewhere below, a door closed. A car engine started in the parking structure and faded into the distance. The building exhaled. Laura stood in her apartment, with its bare mattress and its empty shelves and its single dented cardboard box sitting in the corner where she had left it 6 days ago, and looked at Mayo, who was leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms folded, watching her with an expression she was finally learning to read. "You didn't need me," he said. "I know," she said, "but I'm glad you came." Something shifted on his face. Not a smile. Mayo Kwong did not smile the way normal people smiled. It was more like a door opening 1 inch, just enough to let a sliver of light through before it closed again. He nodded once, turned, and walked toward the connecting door. "Mayo." He stopped. "Thank you. For the room with no windows. For showing me how to walk out of it." He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his back to her, the tattoos on his neck visible above his collar, the dragons, the chains, the scripture, in a language she was beginning to understand. Then he looked over his shoulder, and what she saw in his eyes was not the cold, clinical detachment of a mafia boss assessing a situation. It was the look of a man who had spent 20 years alone in his own rebuilt fortress and had just realized that someone else had found the door. "The room is always there," he said quietly. "The only thing that changes is whether you are locked inside it or standing guard at the door." He paused. "You are standing guard now, Laura." He left. The connecting door closed with its familiar, precise click. Laura stood alone in the amber light of her apartment. She walked to the corner, picked up the cardboard box, and set it on the kitchen counter. She opened the flaps. She pulled out the folded shirts, the phone charger, the framed photograph she had kept turning face down for 6 weeks. She turned it over. It was a picture of herself at 22, smiling, unbroken, standing in sunlight with the posture of a woman who had not yet learned to make herself small. She set the photo upright on the counter. Then she unpacked the rest of her boxes. All of them, the ones she had left stacked by the door, unopened, because some part of her had always believed she would have to run again. She unpacked them slowly, deliberately, placing each item with the kind of intention Mayo had taught her to bring to everything. A coffee mug on the shelf, a blanket on the bed, a pair of shoes by the door not pointed toward the exit, the way they had been for 6 days, but turned inward, facing the apartment, facing home. She was not the woman who had arrived at Greenvale Terrace clutching a cardboard box and performing her fear for anyone who looked at her. She was not the woman who shrank against walls or bit her cheek to keep from crying or measured her safety in single-digit seconds. She was Laura Thomas. She was standing guard at the door of her own life, and next door, behind a wall lined with monitors and a connecting door that had not existed 6 days ago, the most dangerous man in 6 city blocks was watching his security feeds cycle through their rotations. And for the first time in 20 years, the fortress he had built around himself had a window. Can Laura hold on to the strength Mayo forged in her, or will the shadows of Rodney's world find a way to pull her back into the dark? And what is Mayo really protecting Laura, or a secret buried so deep even his own empire doesn't know it exists? Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you do not want to miss what happens next.